To situations in Ukraine continuing to be extremely grim this morning. About 20 civilians, women and children, have left the Ukrainian-held Azovstal steelworks in the besieged city of Mariupol.
They're the first group to leave the plant since the Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered the vast industrial area to be sealed off last week.
Now, elsewhere in Ukraine, Russia has continued to pound southern and eastern Ukraine with missile strikes, leaving many dead or wounded.
Well, joining us now to discuss this is Dr Peter Caddick-Adams. He's a NATO historian and ex-reserve officer. Good morning to you, and thank you so much for joining us. Now, we heard a little bit there. It does sound like quite a complicated operation. How hard is it to seal off an urban area like this?
Well, Mariupol is a huge port city, but what the Russians have done is they've captured most of it, except this major steelworks. And the steelworks was hardened in Soviet days to withstand a nuclear attack. So it's actually 6 stories underground. And that's why the Ukrainian defenders and all the civilians there are managing to hold on. So it's like a sort of, I don't know, a set from Mad Max or something like that. I mean, all these stories underground, the Russians can't get in. The civilian populations and the defenders are surviving down there, so it's a pretty grim existence. But they need to get the civilians out and to safety, and the first 20 have managed to get through.
Can I say that's a depressingly small number? I mean, we think there are, 1,000 or more people trapped inside. 20 out, well, good for them. Good for their families, but it leaves an awful lot of people behind.
The Russians are really not interested in humanitarian corridors, and they've demonstrated that time after time. And this is in the week when the United Nations Secretary-General was visiting President Zelensky in Kiev, and Russian missiles came down on the capital city when he was there. So that really is Russia saying, we're acting unilaterally. We're not going to have anyone else dictate to us how we behave. And really, humanitarian concerns are just not our business. And goodness me, it's day 67 now of what was originally going to be a 3-day war for Russia. We're into the 3rd month. And almost every day we've had reports of Russian atrocities, humanitarian outrages. And I weep for the people of Mariupol, because it's not going to get any easier for them.
What is interesting, though, in the news coming out, now that obviously Kiev is generally being left alone, and places like Lviv are continuing to be comparatively quiet. It's all comparative, isn't it? But, I mean, these reports that the southern and eastern parts of the country are still getting bombarded by Russian missiles. In a way, we're not getting a lot of detail. It almost seems like it's an isolated situation, when, of course, the reality is they're still holding a pretty big swathe of land.
Well, the thing about Mariupol and why the Ukrainians carry on to resist there is it's pinning down huge numbers of Russian forces. And they would be fighting elsewhere and advancing on some of the objectives. So that's why the Ukrainians are carrying on fighting, and that's the ultimate aim. What Ukraine has managed to do in the last 10 days of this new phase of the Russian attack is hold the Russians and actually start to push them back. And that means the long-range Russian artillery just can't get at places like Kharkiv and some of the frontline positions. And so the Ukrainians are actually managing to shield their civilian population more and more. And the news stories we hear about these rocket attacks, they're almost the only way the Russians can get now at the civilian populations. It sounds grim, but it's more positive from a Ukrainian point of view. The Russians are being held back, and their artillery, which can fire 20 kilometers or more, is just being held back. So slowly the tide is turning. And with all these Western weapons pouring into Ukraine, things are beginning to look up, I have to say.
And what's the morale like for Russian troops right now, Peter? Because, as you say, this was a special operation, they were told, were only going to last 2 or 3 days. We're now on day 66 into this war, and they've had to pull back from the northeast of the country, heading more towards the eastern side instead. They must be feeling pretty depleted, right?
Well, I mean, there are two stories here. One is the equipment with which they were provided, even from day one, was lamentable. They were short of food. They were given either out-of-date rations or no rations at all, and that probably explains why they started to plunder and loot. And their medical packs that you find on each Russian soldier who's captured are absolutely pathetic. A couple of band-aids, and that's pretty much it. And the word is going around in Russia now that any kind of wound on the battlefield is fatal because they're so short of combat medics and they're so short of medical equipment. And that's corruption of the Russian armed forces. They've sold a lot of all of this off in the past years. So their morale is low from that point of view. And so many units have taken massive casualties, and they're now being merged. And that's never good for morale if your friends around you are killed, and your particular unit, your band, your battalion, your company has to be merged with another one. So, and you can't hold this secret amongst the troops at the front. And word is getting back to their loved ones back home in the Russian Federation that all is not well. And certainly that's very, very obvious because this is a mission, as we've said, that should have been wrapped up very quickly. But the key date for the Russians is Victory Day, which is the 9th of May. And there will be a big parade in Moscow, as there always is. And that's the moment at which Vladimir Putin had hoped to talk about a victory. So he's desperately looking for something that he can put a positive spin on the 9th of May.
You see, you wonder, don't you, as to what could finally bring this to an end. And you wonder if morale, because it seems very difficult for anyone to get close enough or willing to go on a suicide mission enough to actually take Vladimir Putin out, which presumably would at least put a halt on this for the time being. But could the army itself be key to this? Could morale be the key to this? So that at some point, they just turn round, whether it's the troops or whether it's the generals out in the field or whoever it is, who finally say, we've had enough. We can't do this. We are just going to stop.
Well, in fact, Putin has now sent the Chief of Staff, the Russian Armed Forces, General Gerasimov, down to Ukraine to sort it out himself. And so he's put the top man in place to try and achieve a victory. That's quite clever of Putin because, of course, if it all goes wrong, he's now got a number one scapegoat. And Putin can say it's nothing to do with me, it's not my fault. But we do know there's a power struggle going on in Moscow between all the uniformed security officials, the FSB, their secret service, the border police, the riot police, all the people who do internal security in Russia, and the army. And at the moment, the internal security people are the ones who advise that Ukraine would fall, that they would love Putin to bits, and it would all go swimmingly well. But that's the stable from which Putin himself comes from. And they're discredited, and at the moment it's the army who have the upper hand. So they've been given a chance to try and put some kind of positive spin out of this invasion. So there are warring factions already in the Kremlin, and we'll see how that plays out. But you're quite right. Putin has painted himself into a corner. I mean, he's been burning his bridges with his rhetoric and his actions now we're into the third month of it. So it's very difficult to see how he will come out of this personally.
And Peter, we've been talking about the Russians pulling back from the northeast of Ukraine, focusing now on the eastern part of the country. Can you describe the scenes that have been left behind?
Yeah, I mean, the Russians have never really got into the major cities. And of course, around the cities are all the little sort of satellite villages. To us, they are really the suburbs from which people commute into major places of work, 20, 30 miles, in exactly the way people commute into the big cities in the United Kingdom. And it's those areas that have been really hard hit. This is where the Russians have been going in, taking prisoners, looting, and killing people. And they've been doing that, really. I think that's a reflection on the state of play in the Russian Federation today. We know of the big cities where life is comparable with Western cities. But the moment you go out, the moment you go further east into the small Russian villages, some of them are not brick built at all. They don't have heating. A lot of them don't have asphalt, have any hard standing running through the villages. We're talking about settlements that are, that look and appear and function like somewhere 100 years ago. And these soldiers, conscripts who come from those small settlements come to Ukraine, which is far more westernized, where everybody has television sets and washing machines and dishwashers and cars and all the rest of it. And that's one of the reasons why they're looting. It's jealousy. They can see what's going on. So what they've left is a complete and total mess. And the Ukrainians, bless them, are tidying these places up. Even Bucha, where all the massacres took place, and they found another 3 dead bodies with hands tied behind their back the other day. They're tidying everything up to try and get their own lives back to normal as quick as possible. But the current estimate is the amount of damage the Russians done is over $1 trillion in terms of damage. That's going to be massive to replace. And the only place we're going to get that money from to repair Ukraine is probably Russia. Whether they cough up is another matter.
Isn't it just? OK, Peter Caddick-Adams, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
$1 trillion of damage.
I mean, this is the problem with all of this. When it comes to an end, and let's hope it's soon, actually the rebuilding programme is going to take decades.
Yeah. And not only the mental trauma on the civilians that are there, especially in Mariupol, which we've just been hearing about there. Absolutely horrific.
Dreadful situation.
Yeah, absolutely awful.
If you're doing your bit to help, whether it's volunteering or donating anything, or whether you've got any refugees staying with you, it'd be interesting to hear your perspective on it all, especially if you have got that sort of connection with some of the people directly involved in this. GB Views at gbnews.uk.